The fluorescent lights of the New York Times newsroom hummed their familiar tune as Evan Mitchell stared at his computer screen, the cursor blinking mockingly at an article he'd been trying to finish for 3 days. Outside his window, Manhattan stretched endlessly. Millions of people moving through their lives, each one carrying secrets, traumas, questions they'd never answer. Evan understood that sensation intimately. He was 29 years old, had won a regional journalism award, and yet felt like he was perpetually chasing something that kept slipping through his fingers. His apartment walls were covered with photographs and newspaper clippings. The disappearance of Maura Murray, the murders of the smiley-face killer, the case of Brandon Swanson. Most of his colleagues found his obsession disturbing. His editor had suggested more than once that maybe he should find healthier hobbies. But Evan couldn't stop. Each unsolved case was a thread he needed to pull, a puzzle that demanded to be solved, a victim whose voice deserved to be heard. The truth was darker than professional curiosity. 7 years ago, his younger sister Emma vanished from a parking garage in Philadelphia. She was 22, studying architecture, heading to her car after a late shift at a coffee shop. No body was ever found. No solid leads emerged. The case went cold within months, and the police moved on to other priorities. Evan's parents eventually stopped mentioning her name at dinner. His father turned to alcohol. His mother became a shell of herself, moving through rooms like a ghost. Emma's disappearance had fractured their family into pieces that never quite reassembled. Investigating other people's unsolved cases was Evan's way of maintaining control, of proving that answers existed if you looked hard enough. It was also, he suspected during his more honest moments, a way of avoiding the unbearable fact that sometimes people simply vanished without explanation. He was pulling together notes for an article about the Hinterkaifeck murders, a horrifying case from Bavaria in 1922 that had influenced American understanding of rural crime, when his phone buzzed. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but something made him. Mr. Mitchell. The voice belonged to a woman, controlled but with an undercurrent of urgency. My name is Samantha Reyes. I work for the FBI's Digital Forensics Division, and I've been following your investigative work for the past year, specifically your article on the Keddy Cabin murders. Evan sat up. That article had been read by maybe 5,000 people. The fact that someone from the FBI had noticed was both flattering and unnerving. How did you get this number? That's not important right now, Samantha continued. What's important is that I've been running pattern analysis on cold cases using advanced data modeling and artificial intelligence. I found something that suggests several cases separated by decades and geography might be connected, and I think you might be the right person to help me investigate it properly. Evan's heart rate quickened. What kind of connection? There was a pause. He could almost hear her weighing how much to reveal. The kind that the Bureau isn't interested in pursuing because it contradicts their official narratives. The kind that exists in the spaces between cases, in details that don't fit the standard profiles. And Mr. Mitchell, the kind that suggests we might be looking at a pattern of violence that spans longer than anyone has realized, touching victims across generations. After they hung up, having arranged to meet the following day at a coffee shop in Brooklyn, Evan sat motionless in his apartment. His hands were trembling. For years he'd been searching for patterns, for connections, for meaning in tragedy. And now someone was telling him that those patterns might actually exist, that his obsession might not be the product of grief-twisted thinking, but something real. He looked at the photographs on his wall, at the faces of the missing and the dead. Then he opened his laptop and began researching Samantha Reyes. The coffee shop in Brooklyn smelled like burnt espresso and possibility. Samantha Reyes was already there when Evan arrived, occupying a corner table with 3 laptops and a leather notebook filled with handwritten notes. She was in her mid-30s, with dark circles under her eyes that suggested she hadn't slept properly in weeks, and an intensity in her gaze that immediately told Evan this was someone who'd seen things she couldn't unsee. "Thank you for coming," she said, not bothering with small talk. She pulled up a map on her largest laptop, one that displayed the continental United States with dozens of red pins scattered across it. "These represent cases I've identified as potentially connected. They span from 1978 to 2023. Different states, different victim profiles, different apparent motives. But when you analyze the data, and I mean really analyze it, looking beyond the surface narratives, patterns emerge." Evan leaned closer, studying the map. Some pins clustered in California and the Pacific Northwest. Others were isolated in the Midwest. Several marked locations across the Northeast. "What kind of patterns?" Samantha opened her notebook. "Timing clusters. Certain months see increased activity. Victim demographics that seem randomly selected until you realize they all had something in common. They were all either about to expose something, about to change their lives, or were in positions to know something they shouldn't. Geographic patterns that follow major highways and digital infrastructure hubs. And something more unsettling, evidence that was mishandled or lost in ways that seemed almost deliberate." She pulled up a photograph. A young woman from the 1980s, Sarah, then another, Michael, another, Jennifer. The faces accumulated on the screen, dozens of them, each one a person whose life had been violently interrupted and never explained. "I've spent 3 years on this," Samantha continued, her voice steady but her hands trembling slightly. "It cost me my career at the Bureau. When I brought this to my supervisor, he told me I was seeing patterns that didn't exist, that I was experiencing what he called investigative psychosis, basically that I'd spent so much time in dark places that I was creating monsters out of shadows. They benched me, threatened to remove my security clearance. Now I work freelance, using algorithms to analyze public records, old case files, and data the Bureau refuses to acknowledge." "Why tell me?" Evan asked. "Why risk it?" Samantha's jaw tightened. "Because I failed someone once, a girl named Rachel back in 2009. We were tracking someone we believed was responsible for at least 7 murders across the Northwest. We had evidence. Not enough for prosecution, but enough to investigate. My supervisor closed the investigation, said we were wasting resources. 6 months later, there were 3 more bodies. Rachel wasn't one of them, but she was connected to one of the victims. She was a witness. And when she realized what I had discovered and failed to prevent, she—" Samantha paused, collecting herself. She couldn't live with that knowledge. The guilt consumed her in ways that no official investigation ever could. Evan understood that kind of haunting. He'd been haunted by Emma's disappearance for 7 years, and he'd never stopped moving toward it. Never accepted that some questions don't have answers. But hearing Samantha's story made him realize something else. Pursuing truth could destroy you just as thoroughly as ignorance could. "Show me everything," he said. What followed was 18 hours of immersion into the darker corners of American crime. Samantha had created a massive database, color-coded and cross-referenced with meticulous precision. She'd obtained court documents, police reports, victim autopsy records, witness statements, and digital communications. Some of it was public information. Some of it, Evan suspected, had been obtained through means that weren't entirely legal. The deeper they descended into the data, the more a picture began to emerge. Not of a single killer, but of a pattern of violence that seemed to respond to cultural moments, technological shifts, and social anxiety. The cases clustered around times of major social upheaval, the end of the Cold War, the rise of the Internet, the post-9/11 paranoia, the social media explosion. And they seemed to target people who existed on the margins, people whose disappearances or deaths could be easily dismissed, explained away, or absorbed into the noise of a violent nation. "What are you saying?" Evan asked, though he was beginning to understand. That someone is orchestrating this across 50 years and dozens of states? I'm saying, Samantha replied carefully, that either someone is or we're looking at a kind of collective phenomenon, a pattern in how American society creates victims and how those victims are forgotten. And if it's the first, then the murders are still happening, the pattern is still active, which means the killer is still out there. Outside the coffee shop window, Brooklyn continued its endless motion. Millions of people, millions of lives, and somewhere in that vast, complex web of humanity, someone, or something, continued to unravel threads, leaving devastation in their wake. When Evan finally left Samantha's apartment that evening, his head was spinning. He'd found what he'd been searching for, a connection, a pattern, a narrative that made sense of chaos. But Emma's face kept appearing in his mind, asking a question he couldn't answer. Would finding the pattern also find her? 3 weeks into their investigation, Evan hadn't slept more than 4 hours a night. He'd called in sick to the Times 3 times, then finally admitted to his editor that he was pursuing an independent project that required his full attention. The response was predictable: disappointment, concern about his mental health, a suggestion that he should take some time away from the darkness. Evan had quit. His apartment had transformed into a mirror image of Samantha's workspace. Photographs covered every wall. Red string connected pins on a massive map spread across his living room floor. Coffee cups accumulated on every surface, growing rings of mold that he didn't bother cleaning. He barely ate. When he looked in the mirror, he barely recognized himself. His face had become angular, his eyes hollow, as though something essential was being consumed from within. Samantha had noticed. She'd shown up at his apartment one evening with groceries and a look of concern that reminded him uncomfortably of how his mother used to watch him after Emma disappeared. "You're spiraling," she said simply, unpacking vegetables onto his kitchen counter. "I recognize it because I've done it. This work, it extracts a price." But they were close. They both felt it. The pattern was becoming clearer, more specific. They'd identified a series of cases connected by a single detail, so subtle that no official investigation had caught it. A specific symbol or marking that appeared at each crime scene, always hidden, always only discoverable if you knew exactly what to look for. In one case, it was scratched into the victim's bedroom wall. In another, it appeared in the background of a photograph taken by investigators. In a third, it was embedded in a piece of jewelry the victim had been wearing. The symbol itself was simple, a triangle with a horizontal line through its center. It meant nothing to either of them, but the fact that it appeared across decades and geography meant everything. Samantha had taken the symbol to contacts in academia, cryptography specialists, historians. One of them, a retired linguist from Cornell, had reached out with a hypothesis. The symbol might be connected to old American occult movements from the 1970s, specifically to a fringe group called the Architects of Order. The group had apparently dissolved in the early 1980s, but their ideology had been documented. They believed that certain deaths could reshape reality, that violence committed with intention could alter the trajectory of society itself. "This is insane," Evan had said when Samantha shared this information. "You're talking about a cult. We're supposed to be investigating real crimes, not occult conspiracies." But Samantha had been calm. The crimes are real. The victims are real. Their deaths are real. What the perpetrator believed about those deaths is irrelevant to the fact that they murdered people, and if understanding their beliefs helps us identify them, then we follow the thread wherever it leads. The problem was that the thread was beginning to unravel in ways that made both of them question what they were actually pursuing. Samantha had started having nightmares, vivid, disturbing dreams in which she was walking through a building filled with doors, and every door she opened revealed another door, and behind those doors were the faces of victims, all of them watching her, all of them asking the same wordless question. Evan had begun to notice that he couldn't be in his apartment alone, without feeling watched, as though every photograph on his wall was an eye tracking his movements. They'd met with a forensic psychologist who specialized in criminal behavior, an elderly woman named Dr. Patricia Chen, who had worked on dozens of FBI cases. When they presented their theory, she'd listened carefully, then said something that had stayed with Evan ever since. "You're describing two phenomena that might not be mutually exclusive. One, you could be pursuing a real pattern that suggests a real predator. Two, the act of pursuing this pattern is creating a psychological state that makes both of you more susceptible to seeing significance in randomness. Your brains are looking for connections because you've given them the task of finding connections. That's not paranoia, that's neurobiology." But she'd also said something else, something that had terrified Evan more than any of their discoveries. "Be careful how much of yourself you invest in understanding darkness. There's a point where you stop investigating the darkness and you start becoming part of it." The turning point came on a Tuesday evening. Samantha had been analyzing financial records of known members of the Architects of Order, trying to track whether any of them were still active, still funding operations, still alive. She'd found something, a pattern of small purchases made by someone using a digital currency, purchases that aligned with the dates of several murders. The purchases were mundane: equipment, materials, supplies, but they suggested that someone was still operating under the group's ideology. "We need to go to the FBI with this," Evan had said. "This is too big. This is beyond what we can handle on our own." Samantha had looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "And tell them what? That we've found a pattern that suggests a serial killer operating under an occult ideology. They'll shut us down faster than they shut me down before. Or worse, they'll use our information to close the investigation officially, to convince the public that the cases are solved, even if they're not." "So what do we do?" Evan asked. "We find proof," Samantha said. "We identify who's still operating. We find them before the Bureau can bury the truth again." That night, as Evan lay in bed, unable to sleep, he made a decision. He would push forward. He would find the answers. He would solve the unsolvable. And he would do it for Emma, for all the victims, for everyone whose disappearance or death had been absorbed into the noise of American violence. But somewhere in the back of his mind, a voice that sounded like Dr. Chen's kept repeating, "Be careful how much of yourself you invest in understanding darkness." The warehouse was located in Newark, New Jersey, in a section of the city that had been largely abandoned by legitimate commerce and reclaimed by industrial decay. Evan had wanted to contact the authorities before coming here, but Samantha had convinced him otherwise. "They'll move too slowly," she'd argued. "Whoever this is, they'll disappear if we alert the wrong people. We just need confirmation, proof. Then we go to the FBI with something they can't ignore." So here they were, standing outside a concrete building that had been registered to a shell corporation for the past 15 years, their hands trembling in the cold November air. Samantha had used her remaining FBI contacts to obtain the address after tracing a financial transaction to a storage unit and then cross-referencing property records with known members of the Architects of Order. The last known address for Robert Castellano, a man who had been part of the group's inner circle in the 1970s, was connected to this warehouse. Evan forced the side door. The hinges were rusted but yielded to sustained pressure. Inside, the warehouse was vast and mostly empty, but towards the back they could see light emanating from what appeared to be a constructed room. As they moved deeper into the space, the smell hit them, something like copper and decay, mixed with something chemical that burned their nostrils. Samantha pulled out her phone, preparing to record video evidence. Evan's hands were shaking so badly he could barely keep the flashlight steady. They were about to witness something that would change everything, and some part of him wanted to turn back, to leave this darkness unexplored, to let the mysteries remain mysteries. The room was smaller than expected, perhaps 20 feet by 15 feet, its concrete walls lined with boxes, filing cabinets and shelves containing items that seemed both mundane and sinister. Journals, maps, photographs, newspapers clipped and arranged in patterns. And on every surface, that symbol, the triangle with the horizontal line, drawn, carved and stenciled obsessively. But what made Evan's breath catch in his throat was the wall directly opposite the entrance. It was covered with photographs, dozens of them, and at the center of the collage, positioned with deliberate significance, was a photograph of Emma, his sister. Emma, 22 years old with her familiar smile, her dark hair falling across her shoulders. Emma, who had disappeared 7 years ago and been relegated to a cold case file. Evan couldn't breathe. Samantha's hand found his arm, steadying him, but her face had gone pale. Evan! The sound of movement came from somewhere deeper in the warehouse, not close but distinct. Someone else was here, someone who had been expecting them, or at least someone who had left this room knowing that eventually someone would find it. Samantha grabbed Evan's arm and pulled him toward the exit, but Evan resisted. His eyes were locked on Emma's photograph, on the map pin surrounding it, on the notation in faded handwriting beside her image. The catalyst, the beginning of understanding. Evan, we need to leave, now. Samantha's voice had shifted into something colder, more commanding. She was already pulling her phone out, hands moving with practiced efficiency, but Evan couldn't move. He was frozen in the strange space between his obsession being confirmed and his world completely shattering. Emma wasn't random. Her disappearance wasn't senseless. She had been chosen. She had been part of a pattern. And the realization that his sister's death, her disappearance, her ending, whatever had happened to her, had meaning in the ideology of monsters, was more unbearable than the mystery had ever been. The movement in the warehouse became more distinct. Footsteps. Multiple people, perhaps. Samantha finally managed to pull Evan toward the exit, and they ran back through the cavernous space, back out into the cold night air of Newark. As they reached their car, Samantha's phone buzzed. An unknown number. She answered, listened, and her expression shifted into something between understanding and horror. She hung up without responding and turned to Evan. That was someone in the FBI. Someone who's been monitoring my research. My supervisor. He's known what I was looking for the entire time. He's known about this warehouse. And he just told me that the investigation into Emma's disappearance was deliberately closed because the Bureau made a deal with someone inside the architects group. Someone in exchange for information about other cases. Someone they let walk in order to solve a different crime. Evan felt the ground tilt beneath him. What? Your sister, Samantha continued quietly, wasn't just a victim of a killer. She was leverage. A sacrifice made by the Bureau to protect an informant, and that's information that certain people have spent decades ensuring would never become public. They drove through the night, neither of them speaking. Evan's mind was fracturing along multiple dimensions. Emma had answers now, but those answers were embedded in institutional corruption so deep, so systemic, that they might never reach the light of public knowledge. The pattern he'd been searching for wasn't just a killer operating in the shadows. It was the shadow itself, the infrastructure of violence and cover-up that allowed modern America to function. By dawn, Samantha had made a decision. She was reaching out to journalists she trusted, preparing to leak everything they'd found. It would cost her, possibly her freedom, certainly her remaining credibility with institutions. But the alternative was to let the darkness continue its work, to let the families of victims remain in ignorance, to let the pattern continue unbroken. Evan, meanwhile, looked out at the sunrise over Brooklyn and realized that answering the question of what happened to Emma had only opened a larger, more complicated question. What happened when you looked too deeply into the machinery of your nation and discovered that the machinery was designed to grind people to dust? What happened when you found the pattern, but the pattern itself was so foundational to how society functioned that exposing it risked everything? He didn't have those answers. But he understood now that some questions demanded to be asked regardless of the cost, and some doors, once opened, could never be closed again. The investigation had revealed that mystery and truth existed in different dimensions. The true cases remained unsolved, not because answers didn't exist, but because the answers implicated too many people, too many institutions, too much of the foundational corruption that allowed the system to persist. Evan and Samantha had found the pattern, but understanding it, truly understanding it, required a kind of sacrifice that went beyond professional risk or personal trauma. It required accepting that their nation had built monuments to forgetting, and that the only way to honor the victims was to keep asking questions that nobody in power wanted asked. In the weeks that followed, some information would be leaked. Some investigations would be reopened. But the deepest answers, the architectural understanding of how violence became systematized, how victims became acceptable losses, how the machinery of forgetting ground on, those answers remained where they'd always been, hidden in plain sight, protected by the collective agreement that some darkness was better left unexplored. Evan thought of his sister, of the other victims, of the pattern that connected them all, and he understood that the real terror wasn't that cases remained unsolved. It was that solving them would demand a reckoning that American society wasn't prepared to face.